Yeah, no, it said someone else had stopped it. So
Okay.
It's resumed, I think, now.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know what happened.
Perdona, Ania.
Entonces decía que la dinámica demográfica en Cuba está marcada por un componente migratorio importante que está desafiando también el crecimiento de la población. En este caso yo quería traer las voces de las personas entrevistadas en cuanto sobre todo a este objeto, ¿no? Que sería la emigración. Una de las jóvenes de 22 años entrevistada me dice: mi madre lleva 20 años aquí, lo único que ha hecho con su vida es pasar trabajo. Su suegra también, aunque era maestra, mire usted la pobreza en la que vive, no tienen nada, trabajaron toda la vida ¿para qué? Eso es lo que da el campo. Otra de las personas, refiriendo a las motivaciones para emigrar, apuntan: la vida fuera del campo es otra cosa, tienes un médico cerca o puedes llegar a un hospital si lo necesitas. Otra persona dice: el trabajo en el campo no es vida, siembras para mejorar la comida, para poder comer algo y los ladrones te lo llevan todo. Si no puedes tener ni eso, no tiene sentido pasar tanto trabajo metido aquí. Otra persona dice: aquí no puedes ni ejercer lo que estudiaste, lo único que hay es trabajo y el trabajo no acaba nunca, no hay un cine, no hay una fiesta, no hay nada. En estas narrativas puede ser apreciada la percepción que prevalece sobre la vida en un contexto marcado por precariedades y privaciones. Y esto es percibido también como la vida invivida, ¿no? En palabras de la doctora María Arias. También es importante la centralidad de la figura materna, que en la medida que no quiere que sus hijos e hijas reproduzcan su pobreza, los incitan para salir de los contextos rurales. En este sentido, una de las madres dice: mi hijo se tiene que ir de aquí. Ya la mujer está en Maceo, o sea, en un espacio urbano, y él también tiene que irse. Otra de las madres dice: yo quiero que mi hija y mi nieto se vayan lejos de aquí, tengo que sacarlos de aquí. Ahora el niño comienza la escuela y hay que ir a una escuela que queda distante, y eso es una locura. Una de las personas jóvenes dice: yo quiero llevarme a mi familia, aunque sea para vivir debajo de una alcantarilla. Estoy aquí por necesidad, no quería volver. Y ahora quiero salir para cualquier lugar, no sé, un lugar donde haya trabajo y donde mi hijo tenga una escuela. Otra de las madres refiere: mi hijo está aquí por mí, cuidándome porque estoy enferma, pero en algún momento él tiene que irse. Yo quiero que él tenga otra vida. Estos pasajes refuerzan la centralidad de la figura materna. Y uno de los entrevistados, refiriéndose a la mujer más joven de la comunidad, refiere: yo no sé cómo ella ha aguantado tanto aquí. Ella se tiene que ir. Aquí no hay vida y ella es muy joven. Este foco en la migración como una alternativa de proyección al futuro también es visto en otros contextos estudiados dentro de ese municipio, donde se constata que las proyecciones de futuro inmediato hablan de abandonar estos espacios. Uno de los discursos dice: pienso que mi vida tiene sentido en otro lugar. Y otra persona adulta refiere: lamento que la juventud y los niños no tienen futuro aquí. O sea, estos abordajes y estas narrativas nos están hablando de cómo es percibido el espacio y cómo principalmente la estrategia de migrar es vista como la mejor solución. O sea, estos espacios contienen el entrecruzamiento de múltiples dimensiones sociales, históricas, culturales, políticas, subjetivas, y son construidos a partir de los vínculos que se establecen en estas configuraciones. Las emigraciones hacia los espacios urbanos siguen comprometiendo las dinámicas sociodemográficas y económicas, tanto rurales como urbanas. Los estudios referenciados confirman la existencia de percepciones negativas sobre los contextos rurales asociados a la dureza del trabajo, tanto productivo como reproductivo, a las limitaciones, desventajas, discriminaciones y privaciones que contribuyen a la conformación de esa negatividad, de esa dificultad que es vivenciada por las personas que los habitan y que de maneras disímiles compulsan a salir de esos espacios. Esas precariedades en los contextos que los contextos tienen en la vida social y económica del país no se traduce lo suficientemente en visiones políticas y gestión pública que torne a la ruralidad atractiva para la juventud rural permanecer en estos espacios. Y en este sentido, la academia se constituye como un espacio interesante para hacer visible estas percepciones. Muchas gracias.
Tony,
¿Me
you're
escuchan?
muted.
Ah, disculpe. ¿Me escucharon la intervención?
Sí, te escuchamos perfectamente. Ahora no le escuchamos a Tony.
Ah.
Te escuchamos perfectamente, Ania. Muchas gracias. Y estamos
Gracias
aplaudiendo.
a ustedes.
Tony, ¿tienes algún problema también, no?
Yes, sorry about that. Bueno, entonces invito preguntas, invito comentarios para Ania. Tenemos 5 minutos, bueno, incluso más si es necesario. Entonces le doy la palabra a todos. Cualquier pregunta, cualquier comentario. No. Ok, Pam.
Bueno, Alex primero. Alex y después yo.
Gracias. Yo quería comentar dos cosas. Primero, cuán importantes son estos tipos de estudios que nos muestran determinadas realidades específicas, concretas, particulares en nuestro país. Y esto yo creo que nos lleva a pensar un poco o a desmontar la idea de que la implementación de los principales ejes de nuestro proyecto político social tiene los mismos impactos para todos los espacios del país, para todas las regiones del país, para cada uno de los rincones de nuestro país. Y yo creo que es un elemento, hay información, hay datos que nos llevan a pensar cómo es que se han traducido las políticas públicas vinculadas a los principales ejes de ese proyecto político social cubano en los diferentes espacios, en los diferentes rincones del país, y cómo el carácter universal de estas políticas pues muchas veces, más de lo que deseamos, esconden realidades que supuestamente debíamos haber, o sea, no deberían existir de esta manera o no deberían ser condiciones de vida para muchas personas. Yo creo que para nadie. Y a mí se me ocurre pensar una de las importancias de este trabajo que nos comparte Ania en este sentido, en cómo nos puede ayudar a repensar las políticas y un poco que deberíamos investigar, deberíamos un poco buscar más información de cómo esas políticas son traducidas e implementadas en todas las regiones del país, sobre todo en aquellas que se han colocado en situaciones de mayor vulnerabilidad y de mayor desventaja. Gracias.
Bueno, gracias, Alex. ¿Quieres comentar, responder, Ania?
Sí. Bueno, gracias, Ale, por la intervención, ¿no? Yo quería resaltar, o sea, dentro de las consecuencias, ¿no? De estos índices. En Cuba, el índice de desarrollo humano, por ejemplo, que es un índice en el sentido que lo que proyecta es la media, ¿no? No permite, o sea, como todas las medidas de media, no permite ver con profundidad los extremos, o sea, porque las provincias orientales tienen un índice de desarrollo humano inferior a la media del país, pero si usted lo mira numéricamente, el índice de desarrollo humano de Cuba puntea dentro de los índices altos, y entonces es muy discreta la diferencia y no permite, o sea, no permite ver en profundidad cómo estos procesos de desruralización han acontecido en esos contextos, los procesos de vaciamiento de espacios, sobre todo muy marcados por los procesos de reconversión azucarera a partir del cierre de los centrales, y es un proceso bien estudiado por la doctora María Arias, que no sé si estará hoy aquí, no la he visto, pero estará en otros momentos con nosotros, y de la territorialización de las desigualdades, que son aspectos también estudiados por la doctora Mayra Espina, estudiados por María del Carmen Zavala y otras académicos y académicas del país, ¿no? Entonces, a mí me parecía interesante resaltar cómo, a pesar de la disminución drástica de la población joven, cómo sigue estando concentrada en estas provincias que presentan estos menores índices y este menor desarrollo. Este último contexto que yo trabajé para mi tesis doctoral es una comunidad que tiene paneles solares a partir de enero del 2019, pero cuando yo comencé a estudiar no tenía electrificación, y tiene la escuela más cercana a 5 kilómetros, y el acceso al barrio es bastante inaccesible, o sea, son particularidades, ¿no? Bien específicas. Entonces, como decía Ale, yo no pretendo dar voz porque esas personas tienen sus voces, yo como siempre digo, amplifico esas voces en otros espacios, y este es un espacio que agradezco mucho precisamente para traer esas voces que me parece, o sea, estoy convencida que esas percepciones dan contenido a políticas que necesitan ser situadas, que necesitan ser contextualizadas, como decía Ale, a las necesidades y a las demandas de estos contextos, porque es un bombillo rojo el envejecimiento poblacional, pero pienso que se ha quedado más en el qué hacer que en el cómo hacer, o sea, cómo vamos a hacer para retener, para que resulten más atractivos estos espacios rurales, no vistos solo como espacios de producción agrícola, que es otra visión que ha sesgado mucho la visión hacia lo rural, sino visto en sus múltiples funciones, en esa multiplicidad de funciones que envuelven los contextos rurales como un espacio de trabajo y de vida, ¿no? Y entonces, en este sentido, me parece que necesitamos voltar, o sea, girar esa mirada académica, política, social, demográfica hacia las juventudes, y sobre todo con foco enfático hacia las juventudes rurales, que son clave en el desarrollo económico y social del país, porque es donde se produce la alimentación, que es un rubro bien precarizado, ¿no? El autoabastecimiento, ¿no?, de la alimentación, sobre todo en estos momentos puntuales donde está tan limitado la principal entrada de divisa al país, que es el turismo, y cómo estamos respondiendo con la producción para el autoconsumo, pues sencillamente bien precarizado, ¿no? Porque lo urbano come lo que se produce en los contextos rurales principalmente, ¿no? Y entonces esto me parece que es un foco que necesita énfasis, necesita una atención emergencial en este sentido. Gracias.
Bueno, gracias, Ania. ¿Otra pregunta, Par? ¿Fuiste la segunda?
Sí, soy la segunda, pero estoy también mirando en el chat Tony. Miriam me está preguntando que si Ania puede compartir su correo. Si no lo quieres hacer aquí, Ania, yo se lo puedo mandar.
Sí, es un placer.
Okay,
es mi nombre completo, Ania Pupo Vega, @gmail.com. Un placer recibir sugerencias, compartir experiencias. Yo también estoy interesada en algunos correos. Ania con una sola N.
Ania Pupo Vega @gmail.com. @gmail.com.
Eso. Gracias.
Y luego hay una pregunta de parte de Rosa. No quiero tomar mucho tiempo, así que mi pregunta es muy breve y después pasamos a Rosa. Me interesó mucho lo que dices, me encantaría saber más de tu investigación, porque no sé si lo sabes, Tony y yo llevamos varios años con un proyecto sobre la provincia de Granma y 3 municipios dentro de la provincia de Granma, y nos interesa, nos fascina. Bueno, para mí, por lo menos desde el punto de vista sociocultural y un poco relacionado con la ponencia de los compañeros de Manzanillo, cómo la cultura y las prácticas culturales, la educación, por ejemplo, y la formación de valores pueden cambiar esa visión negativa de lo que es el espacio rural, y sobre todo lo que dijiste al principio, que siempre el espacio rural se expresa según un lenguaje urbano. Eso es súper interesante. Como aquí decimos modelo de déficit, como una falta, no en sus propios términos, sino como una falta. Y me parece que tiene que ver con también, porque usamos muchas veces la palabra desarrollo sin definir muy bien lo que queremos decir por desarrollo. Y me parece importante saber si se puede hacer una distinción más fina de lo que se quiere decir por desarrollo en distintos espacios, o sea, urbanos o rurales, porque a veces el desarrollo se relaciona muy íntimamente con lo que se llama la modernidad, ¿no? Lo mecanizado, lo industrializado, etcétera. Por eso tantas citas que tú compartiste sobre el trabajo, pasar trabajo sin tener acceso a esa vida moderna. No es una pregunta, simplemente me parece fascinante tu tema y me gustaría que sigáramos hablando y colaborando un poco sobre el tema.
Sí, gracias por esa disposición para colaborar. Ustedes tienen mi colaboración plena. Solo apuntar también que este tema de la educación es bien interesante, y cuando entramos en este municipio Cacocún, Alexander y Daisy trabajaron esta dimensión de la educación en un diagnóstico que hicimos, ¿no? en estos espacios, un diagnóstico participativo sobre varias dimensiones, y estaba la dimensión educativa. Y una de las cuestiones referenciadas es cómo en las propias escuelas lo que se reproduce es lo urbano como el modelo de desarrollo, ¿no? Y es interesante también cómo en los medios de difusión, yo lo coloco en la tesis también, en mi tesis doctoral, en los medios en los medios de difusión y de comunicación, la televisión, que en Cuba es alta consumidora de televisión, y veo que uno de los trabajos va a estar enfocado en Vivir del Cuento, un programa humorístico que tiene una presentación semanal en Cuba. Cómo se representa la persona rural reforzando esos estereotipos. O sea, siempre que presentan que llega un oriental a La Habana, es una persona bruta, es una persona conservadora, una persona rígida, o sea, roza con lo anormal, o sea, roza con lo que rompe cualquier ideario, imaginario de una persona urbana, ¿no? Y esto es importante. En otro programa radial de una audiencia tremenda en Cuba, no sé si, creo que ya no se escucha, yo salí hace 4 años de Cuba, estoy hace 4 años fuera de Cuba, que es Alegrías de Sobremesa. También el personaje oriental era el personaje bruto, que no asimilaba, que no comprendía, entonces estos medios de comunicación y la investigadora Adriana Elías también tiene trabajos en ese sentido sobre la juventud rural, y habla de este impacto de los medios. Es interesante cómo eso hay que subvertirlo, o sea, precisamente es un medio para educar. Y una de las cuestiones también que la escuela refuerza que lo más importante sería salir de allí. Y una de las personas nos decía, yo me quedo aquí porque yo tengo una manera de sobrevivir, yo tengo un conuco, un pedazo de tierra, pero mi familia tiene que salir. Y yo leía ese salir como un hueco, como algo donde estás atrapado, es algo que está marcando esa subjetividad, ¿no? Entonces, bien interesante también cómo ellos demandan, aquí no hay un cine, antes se podía ir a Holguín, pero con las cuestiones de la transportación, las dificultades del combustible y lo inaccesible del lugar, que la distancia física no es una cuestión, o sea, está a 8 kilómetros de lo que es la zona urbana, pero te demoras 3 o 4 horas para llegar a caballo, como llegaba yo, ¿no? Para hacer mi trabajo de campo, porque no hay otra manera de llegar, sobre todo si llueve. Si llueve es malo y si hay sequía también. Entonces, no hay un mejor momento para entrar allí. Y me parece importante que se pudiera reforzar. Allí hemos trabajado con varias ONGs internacionales, vascas, sobre todo, reforzando también la dimensión económica y la dimensión de género. Y sería interesante también trabajar estas dimensiones de la cultura, de la participación. Sobre otras dimensiones yo voy a hablar en mi presentación mañana, que abro un poco más, o sea, salgo de las juventudes y hablo un poco más en sentido general sobre los principales resultados de la investigación. Gracias.
Gracias a ti, Ania.
Bueno, muchas gracias. No sé, la última pregunta me parece por el momento, viene de Rosa. Rosa, ¿tienes micrófono o quieres que lo lea yo? Rosa. Bueno.
Perdón, prefiero solo leerla porque es muy sencilla, Ania. Tú hablabas de la presencia mayoritaria, a diferencia con otras partes del país, de los jóvenes en la región oriental. Entonces, la pregunta que yo te hago es, ¿cómo viste este tema sobre dividiendo entre hombres y mujeres? Y si esa presencia juvenil tiene también algo que ver con el embarazo adolescente, ¿y qué pasa con esas mujeres que en la edad de la adolescencia tienen hijos, deciden quedarse o quieren irse también? Gracias.
No te veo, ¿es Rosa Bon quien habla?
Aquí.
Sí, Ania. Saludos.
Te conocí la voz. Ok. Bueno, la emigración es fundamentalmente femenina. O sea, en el último contexto estudiado, solo había 3 personas jóvenes. Un hombre de 17, un hombre de 27 y una mujer de 22. Entonces los hombres, los 2 estaban vinculados al trabajo agrícola con los padres. Y en este sentido yo hablo también de un potencial perdido, ¿no? Porque uno de los 2 tiene 12 grados. Y la muchacha estudió estudios gastronómicos, o sea, técnicos gastronómicos, ¿no? Y trabajaba en el polo turístico de Holguín, pero no pudo seguir viviendo en Holguín, tuvo que regresar. Por eso ella dice, yo tuve que regresar, aunque no hubiera querido regresar, pero tengo que irme de aquí. Y entonces el embarazo en esos lugares, yo, con tan pocas personas jóvenes, no me dio para estudiar. Ella tiene un niño de 2 años, pero no se presentó en las poblaciones estudiadas como un fenómeno, ¿no? Como un objeto llamativo, ¿no? En este sentido. Pero sí está siendo una problemática a nivel de espacios rurales en la provincia.
Bueno, gracias, Ania. ¿Tenemos más tiempo o seguimos a la próxima, me parece, no?
Sí, podemos seguir y después hay tiempo al final, ¿no?
Claro. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Ania. Y bueno, y felicidades también por eso. Bueno, doy el aplauso.
Gracias a todas las personas que escucharon y a las que preguntaron también.
Ahora bien, Bueno, ahora seguimos con la segunda presentación de la sesión, pero no sé si se trata del español o de inglés, pero yo sé que hay dos personas solamente aquí presentes, ¿no? Porque Sara Kozameh no aparece, ¿es verdad?
Sí, sí.
Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
Solo los dos. Sí, yo puedo hablar en español, pero prefiero en
No,
inglés.
that's fine.
Hace rato que hablo en español. Está bien.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'll introduce you. I know everybody can read it, but I'll do you the courtesy of introducing you all. It's Elisa Botella, Universidad de Salamanca, Marisa Wilson, University of Edinburgh, and Sara Kozameh of Princeton University. And the title is There Are No Black Farmers in Cuba, New and Old Agrarian Questions. Over to you then, Marisa, and Elisa as well. Yep. Okay.
So can you see the screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I will just start off our presentation today. We did present a similar paper last year. We've been working on this for a while. And recently, Sara has joined us as well in developing this paper. So this is sort of a new area for us. So we're taking our time to really, hopefully, develop it in a rigorous way because it's a very complex issue. So let's hopefully we'll get some good feedback and maybe some directions as well for the research. So the paper here is based on this concept of race. It's a social category that we understand in terms of the lived experience of racism in the Cuban countryside. So I'm drawing from my ethnographic fieldwork. In the full paper, we'll be drawing from Sara's oral history research. And we're also going to be drawing from primary data and secondary historical literatures on recent land distribution data, which is quite limited, I have to say. So this very charged sentence here, where are the Black farmers, actually comes from my ethnographic fieldwork. It was a discussion that I had during fieldwork. And so some of this is based on interviews and discussions that took place there. So this is a quote from the fields. Yes, there are some Black farmers. My own grandfather is a campesino, but there are very few. There are very few. So when this research participant was working in ANAP, the National Association of Small Producers or Small Farmers in Cuba, there is a CCS and a CPA, two different types of cooperatives, but there are no Black farmers. In the CCS, which is the credit and service cooperative where farmers have individual plots of land. The only Black farmer was my grandfather. He had a little land for sugar. So he goes on to say that my grandfather got a little land, but he didn't have tractors, very little fertilizer, and little help from the CCS or ANAP. So this is him remembering his grandfather, and this data is actually from a recent follow-up interviews, but also it's from ethnographic research carried out in 2005 to 2007, again in 2014. So the key emphasis here is that the other white farmers, he's expressing here that they had connections to the party and the military. They had these resources, but Black farmers, like my grandfather, did not. So in this paper, we're tackling the racial question in Cuba's agrarian transformations, reflecting on continuities between current and past racial inequalities in the Cuban countryside. So we're looking at kind of broader issues, theoretical issues and agendas that we're interested in are certain gaps in the literature on new and old agrarian questions. So we'll go into this in the first part of the paper, but there's two issues here. The old agrarian question, it really focuses on class more than any other kind of inequalities and doesn't really look at intersectionalities between racial, class, gendered, and other types of inequalities.
So,
sorry.
Marisa, the presentation is not working. You are still in slide number 1.
Oh.
So I don't know.
That's weird. Okay, thanks for telling me. I'm wondering why that's happening because it's working for me. That's a bit of an issue here.
Yeah.
Should I stop? I'll stop sharing and then I'll share again. Sorry about that.
You can try doing that. Sorry, I just thought you were still talking to the first slide, the opening slide, but
no. Let's see if I can try again. No, that was not the first slide. Are you seeing the whole presentation?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So now you are in slide number 3. So probably now it's working. Yeah.
I'll start.
Sorry, Marisa.
No problem. Thanks for telling me. So I'll start this and see. Hopefully you can see that slide.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, so these are kind of the theoretical agendas of the old and new, what Philip McMichael calls the new agrarian questions. And the new agrarian question we're sort of identifying as having also some gaps in understanding the different variations between what we're calling peasants and peasant-state alliances, and how these may hinder wider goals of inclusivity. So I'll get into this in the first section, which talks about the new and old agrarian questions and the relation to the Cuban context. Then we're going to go a little bit into the detail on the land distribution data. And then we'll come back to some of the ethnographic material in the third section and then conclude. So the old agrarian question sort of talks about the main question is what happens to peasants under capitalism. The idea is that peasants are an awkward class. They feed themselves, and the general idea is that they will die out. They will not exist anymore because in the countryside, when capitalism enters, you will have a differentiation between large-scale farmers who become the capitalist farmers, and then you have the people who lose their lands and become agricultural workers, working classes. So peasants in both capitalist and communist versions of this old agrarian question are seen as what Marx called sacks of potatoes. They're going to die out. They're an awkward class that will not exist in this teleology. So, however, we know the peasantry has not disappeared. In this case, we're talking about peasantry in terms of people who produce subsistence, crops for themselves, their households, but also some food for the market that is sold usually in their local area. We also know that the peasantry transforms through the formation of classes, but also through other forms of social differentiation, such as racial and gender differentiations. Under this recent, fairly recent, last few decades of neoliberal globalization, peasantry has become really crucial in domestic food production and existing alongside this agro-industrial production that leads to import dependency, particularly in countries in the global south. So then that points to a kind of new agrarian question, which I'll get to soon. It's this new agrarian question of la via campesina and food sovereignty movements.
Marisa, we have the same problem, it looks.
Oh no. Well, you know what? Maybe I just need to keep it like this. Can you see it like this?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you just don't go into the into the slide view, it's good.
I can do that.
Thank you.
Sorry. So this is kind of why we have a new agrarian question, because there's unanswered questions, unanswered things going on, and there needs to be more analysis of what's happening in the countryside. So the new agrarian question is more recent, coming from the social movements literatures, particularly in Latin America. And as I said, La Via Campesina is one of the main examples of this movements that really try to draw in not just class, but other kinds of social inequalities, both within and out with the peasantry. So it's not just the peasantry, but people who landless groups, social groups in the countryside, people who might have lost their land in the past, but also agricultural workers. So this includes ethnic, racial, gendered, ecological forms of resistance or subversion to this neoliberal globalization. So as I said, Via Campesina is really, this is a central narrative of a more inclusive and alternative transformation and change that includes peasants, but also landless workers. However, there's still an issue here because this ideal of inclusivity could be hindered by past and present alliances that may favor some peasants and workers over others. In Latin America and the Caribbean, this particular context, you have long-term patron-client relationships. There's long-term agrarian transformations that have happened over time according to different political and in some cases ideological alliances between quote unquote peasants and the state. And this was Alain de Janvier was so eloquently expressed in his book, which is still very much an important book on the topic. So the next, so now thinking about the old agrarian question in Cuba, as I just said, the old agrarian question subsumes all social relations to class relations. And it's consistent really with the revolutionary project in Cuba. Race, in some ways, was encompassed by class, not ostensibly, because the revolution really did counteract structural inequalities when it came to the public sense in terms of racial inequalities in organizations, particularly state organizations. But there is an elimination of, with the elimination of private property and class exploitation, the idea is that racial exploitation would eventually disappear. There's quite a lot of research now that's showing that in everyday life, racism continues. So in Cuba, the new agrarian question is also relevant. This is a poster of the 7th Congress of the Coordinadora Latinoamericana de Organizaciones del Campo that collaborated with La Via Campesina. This was held in Cuba, kind of led by ANAP, and it was expressing a unified approach to progressive agrarian change. So I can note that ANAP is state-sponsored. It's an independent organization, but sponsored by the state. And as I've written in other contexts, and a lot of people have written about, that the state has really had an important and crucial role, really, in Cuba's food sovereignty and agroecology movements. So those kinds of alliances have been crucial for progressive agrarian change in Cuba and for feeding populations. Still, there's alliances that might be informal and perhaps even formal between states, peasants, and possibly workers that might hinder goals of inclusivity, which is what we're going to come to in this paper. So I'll pass it on to Elisa for the next section.
Okay, thank you, Marisa. Now we are trying to find out where are the black farmers. I mean, we are trying to connect in the dots, going from the new to the area, to the old to the new area questions. And this means that first of all we need to know who are the peasants in Cuba, taking into account the ongoing process of land reforms and the last decree laws on the delivery of land in usufruct enacted by Díaz-Canel, for example. According to the last data, nowadays in Cuba, small farmers held in usufruct 40% of the land use compared to state farms that dropped from 82% in the late 80s to 20% of cultivated land nowadays. This is also linked to other research by Mesa Lago that indicated the lack of official information on the features of these usufructuaries, such as origin, age, gender, race, education, location. I mean, all these questions related to the new agrarian question, as Marisa mentioned before, and the need to undertake qualitative research to overcome this problem. Therefore, we're going to try to link all this literature on the agrarian question in Cuba to the data available on race and agriculture in Cuba. This means that in terms of employment, and this is the only information available by Oficina Nacional de Estadísticas de Cuba, this 2016 population census based on this classification criteria on the color of the skin, this classification white, black, mulatto, or mestizo, which is obviously quite difficult to define in Cuba. I mean, who are black and who are white peasants. I mean, this is difficult. Or where are the mixed race peasants? Anyway, we are going to take into account this criteria, and according to this data, we see that the differential is significant in this category of farmers and skilled agricultural, livestock, and fishery workers, where the black population is significantly underrepresented. This means that of people in this category, 68.2% are white, 7% black, and 24.7% mestizo. In terms of ownership, so we need to connect agricultural employment to ownership. We are just talking about the Cooperativas de Crédito Servicio and the new usufructuaries. There is also a lack of data. So the only available data we found is this by Morales Rodriguez 2007 that stressed that when considering the private sector formed by these CCS and usufructuaries, he found that 2% of these owners were black and 98% were white.
Elisa, could I ask you to move closer to the microphone?
Oh, yeah. Or maybe I can... 1 minute, please. Okay.
That's better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. So this is quite shocking because if we take into account this idea of the situation and the opportunities, we can move to the next slide, Marisa. If we take into account this idea of the privilege of being a Cuban peasant, because Cubans have more opportunities to engage in agriculture, and they have also more opportunities to produce food for subsistence. If we compare Cuba to other Latin American countries, this is especially the case as some peasants can sell their produce through the tourist sector. I mean, this is quite shocking because taking into account the data, we see this lack of participation of black farmers, and is something we really need to include in order to understand the new agrarian question and the extent to which this new agrarian question is aligned to this idea of via campesina. So how can we get more information? We can move to the next slide, Marisa. Thank you. So given that peasants in Cuba are better off than others, this exclusion of Cubans of color, Afro-Cubans from the peasantry, is really alarming. I mean, because their exclusion for other financial supports, as we see in the case of De La Fuente of Hastings Research, in terms of remittances, employment. So what are the historical and everyday patterns that underpin such inequalities? And there we go to the third section that Marisa is gonna complete.
Okay, so I've kind of seen some of the limited data, and I always question these statistics anyway, but we can see that, you know, this isn't a problem of the revolution. This is an issue that goes way back. It's historical, and it's also everyday. So racism has existed always, according to this research participant. The Black person was seen as labor force, brute labor, while whites were seen as more intelligent, better for professional jobs. I've lived through this for many years. It is inside me. So if we look back to the past, obviously, racism was really embedded in the distribution of resources, including land, in Cuba and other places across the Americas because of slavery. And I think this is something that we'll go into more detail in the paper, particularly with Sara's expertise in agrarian history in Cuba. But there are some important literatures. This paper by Luis Perez showing that in 1912, the so-called race war, there were actually in Eastern Cuba, particularly quite a few people of color who had access to land, who were using land and producing land for their own households and for sale. And this was a characteristic across the Caribbean. There are always plots alongside the plantations. So enslaved peoples generally continued to produce and had to produce often for their own subsistence. They didn't have a choice. The same was the case for Cuba. But this 1912 race war took away, it led to the basically usurpation of lands from people of color. They didn't have land titles in the first place, and basically lost lots of lands in the aftermath of that. It's worth noting that, as Ania had pointed out, that there's many differences within Cuba, and particularly this difference between East and West. And there's very different patterns of racialized agrarian change and racial capitalism prior to the revolution, and resistance, indeed, as Sara's work shows us. So from the very foundations of sort of Cuba as a colony, structural racism existed. And it did continue, continued according to this research participant, it continued well into the 1990s when the agrarian, when lands were starting to be redistributed since the 1990s. According to this perspective, the people the government wanted received lands. The distribution of land was not equal. He says all the white professionals in the cooperative that he worked for got cars and computers. They were in charge of production. So if there was a problem, they had to have transport and computer technology to solve it, but I never got transport or a computer. Now, this kind of structural violence or structural racism, which is about the distribution of resources, has always coexisted with a kind of epistemic or symbolic violence. There's always been racial differences, and it's very complex because as this research participant talks about, there's differences between whites, between blacks, and hierarchies within the populations who might identify as black, and then between blacks and whites. The problem is not that of color, but of people's way of reasoning. And there's studies of early immigration from Haiti and Jamaica that show that actually there's layers and there's a hierarchy that's based on a colonial hierarchy that entered in within people of color themselves, where they're differentiating each other. But there are also other layers. There's gendered hierarchies of virtue and honor that Verena Martinez-Alier talks about. Hannah Garth has recently written about this in the context of racial hierarchies as well. She talks about levels of culture and people of color feeling like they have to dress up to go to the farmer's market. This was a thin layer of armor, she claims, that enabled people that she did work with to face everyday forms of racism. So they're racial, gendered, and class-based measuring rods, I call them, for measuring a person's worth, that are laying on top of the kind of structural forms of racism. Now, in addition to this, the ethnographic research is also showing that there's political capital as a measuring rod. So the idea that Black people have to work harder, have to be in order, to work harder to demonstrate that this is, that they are good workers in this case, in order to get respect. I've noted here that one of my friends who was a Cuban of color lost their PCC card, which is their Communist Party card. And this was a devastating moment for them because it was a proof that they were in order. So this is another layer to the research. So just to reflect on the old and new agrarian questions, come back to that theme. So despite the achievements of the revolution, which we're not negating here, it has profound achievements. The revolution did not directly target these ingrained structural and epistemic violences in the countryside. So there's ongoing intersectionalities between newer, or we're kind of hypothesizing these as kind of newer political forms of capital and older cultural orders of worth. So in terms of the old agrarian question, it's more than just class. There's cultural measuring rods such as levels of culture, gendered ideas of honor and virtue. These are embedded in racialized relationships and exclusions in access to land and other resources. In terms of the new agrarian question between states, peasants, workers, and the alliances between them, there are political and ideological alliances that seem to be occurring that lead to the need for Cubans of color to work harder or to be in order and to have political capital in order to be respected and perhaps to get resources. So then the conclusion I'll pass on to Elisa then.
Okay, thank you, Marisa. So we want to go towards an inclusive understanding of agrarian change, and understanding that we didn't take into account in our previous research. We can move to the next slide, Marisa. Thank you. Because we think that the new and the old agrarian question are both key, are relevant to the Cuban context, and we need to put together in order to understand how race and discrimination in the Cuban countryside, in rural areas, is experienced and can be addressed. And this also implies that we need to go further and to move beyond these previous views of Cuban representation and include these racial inequalities in this process, within this process of Cuban representation, including our own research, as I said before. So this means that although Cuba and its alternative model have created opportunities for peasants and landless, pre-revolutionary racial inequalities significantly reduce Afro-Cuban access to land, and this is what we are trying to demonstrate with this quantitative and qualitative and ethnographic data. So here we stress the need to measure these rods of worth in Cuba that led to structural and epistemic violences, and how this created a dilemma for Cubans, but not only for Cubans, but also for scholars who are interested in inclusive models of agrarian transition in Cuba. And this is basically what we are trying to do in this work in progress. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Yes, and indeed Cuban scholars, I can add. So I'll stop sharing.
Right. Thank you very, very much indeed, and for surviving the problems of the technology again. So,
okay.
Right. Perfect timing, actually, because we've got time left for questions, not only to the two of you, but also, and that can be in either Spanish or English, no problem. But also, it's interesting how much your paper has crossed with Ania's paper as well, as you, Marisa, drew attention to. And I think it's interesting that, so if you wanted to ask questions of Ania as well, but let's start with the questions from Marisa and Elisa. Who wants to start? Miriam, you indicated you wanted to speak, so off you go. Microphone.
Yeah, switch off the microphone, Miriam, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. But I would like to make a reflection of what I know as a Cuban and also experience from here as well, and the previous paper. First, the work in the rural area is not glamour, and it's not in Cuba. In Cuba, is not the condition of the agricultural and the rural life hasn't been very attractive as it was presented before. Now, I will not use the word exclusion of the Black people to participate in the agrarian work, but exodus from the people of Black communities in the rural to the cities where they have more potential and more possibilities, specifically in art. And art and sport, and they see moving into the city, moving into the urban space to advance their life more than remain in the countryside. Then it's a bit different that they were excluded and pushed out of the rural space than they found easy to move from the rural space because they have no property of the land for previous distribution and tradition. For instance, Matanza, which I know, the Black population in Matanza is concentrated before the revolution, just the beginning of capitalism, in the city where they have their local life and their strong movement of art. They didn't want to be in the land because they suffer enough. And that is in the memory of the family, which is quite close. It's not that far like in other countries. The slavery in Cuba was close. The punishment of the Black people was still alive in the story of the family. And if they have the opportunity, they go away. That is one thing. The other one of the reference that you read as one of the Black farmers is exactly the same as a colleague of mine here in the United Kingdom. He's a white theorist physicist that were born in the rural space. And he said, I don't want to go back to Cuba because I don't have a future in the finca. I don't have a future in the finca. I don't have tractor, I don't have anything. I cannot be living as a farmer. Then that is not only exclusive to suffer by the Black, it's suffering everybody. The countryside need more attention. The rural life and development need more attention. But I am not quite convinced, even when your work is so robust in terms of a statistic of 2% of Black and 98%, which I believe totally, not believe, I trust. It's not the whole story. It's something related with history and opportunities in the urban space that Black people take over easily than white people.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points, Miriam. I think, this is just, and I really would like to initiate conversation because this is really just a work in progress. Recently, I've done more work in Trinidad and Tobago, and I know that that's very similar in terms of what you're saying. The history is a lot of the Afro-Trinidadians moved away. They wanted to leave the countryside. They wanted to go to the cities. And the Indo-Trinidadians kind of took their place in a way. Indentured laborers were imported from the British, from the British colonial. And so that is a very familiar story, I think, across the Caribbean. I think that's part of the story for sure. I think there's lots of different layers to this story. I think it's important to think about and recognize that history where I'm not a historian, but I'm aware that there were Afro-Cubans that had quite a lot of land and then lost their lands. So that was way back. And having done some research, as an anthropologist, I sort of start with the perspectives of the people that I've done research with and, kind of highlight those to start with. And so that's the direct words of the people that I've conducted research with. And I think it's a matter of the everyday, looking into the everyday patterns and how people maneuver and relate to one another in everyday life. in terms of the experience of what racism feels like, I guess. In terms of the distribution of land, though, I think you've made some really important points. But I also think that it is a, working hard. I've never worked as a Cuban peasant. I can imagine it's very hard. It's very hot. There's some ethnographic material I have that shows that the lucha, the everyday fight, has to do with food for the most part, and the most expensive food is fruits and vegetables. So if you have access to fruit and vegetables, inevitably you're going to have an advantage in some way, because you'll be able to not only use that as gifts, but also to be able to sell it. And you won't have to have, crucially, you won't have to have the hard currency or the money to have to engage in that lucha and try to find the fruits and vegetables of the very nutritious things. And indeed the animals, you have mixed farms. There are some amazing representations of agroecological farming in Cuba, which use those mixed farms, and people are able to feed their families. I think there's a lot that needs to be questioned here in terms of how, whether or not, I can't express the motivations of people, of Afro-Cuban people, except through the words of the ethnographic material that I have. So I think there will be some unanswered questions here, which will require further research.
Let me do the last comment. I remember working in the laboratory of pharmaceutical industry that we had a day of the week going to collect coffee in the Cuban belt of the countryside. Mm-hmm. And it was one for each center. I went once, take my camión para irme para el campo. Yeah. We worked the whole day, but we have to come back by buses. Mm-hmm. And I was the whole time collecting coffee with another two younger black boys. Mm-hmm. When we finished, I just, let's go. I said, no. We have to change our clothes. I was dirty from the hair to the toes. Yeah. Completely. And he said, we have to, you are white. You don't have problem. But we are black. Mm. We have to dress properly in the bus. Mm. And he said, you are wrong. This is so in their own head, which I don't know is transmitted by family or whatever. This need of, they have to show appearance to earn respect.
Yeah, I'm not.
Rather, for me was, I feel proud that I am dirty because I come from the countryside.
It's interesting. I think this perspective is, sorry to keep taking over, Elisa, but I feel like we have to resort to a lot of the literatures on sort of the way it feels to be in a black body, which we don't know. I feel like, I don't have the answer, but I can resort to the people I've done work with, research with, and also there's quite a lot of scholarly research on the way on moving through life in a black body and how the experience of that. And I think it's more than passing on culture and understandings between generations, but it's actually the everyday interactions that one has when you're moving through life in a black body, and the kinds of respect you might get in some contexts. And I think it's really interesting to point to Hannah Garth's book, which is called Food in Cuba, The Pursuit of a Decent Meal. And it's been really interesting to look through because she's also of African descent, also from the US, but having experienced a little bit of that herself doing ethnographic fieldwork. It's enlightening, and I feel I have to be quite humble because I don't have that embodied experience.
Well, I just wanted to add, thanks a lot, Miriam, for your comments and your ethnographic story. It is quite interesting, and I totally agree with what you just said. But I think we really need to take into account peri-urban and suburban areas, because in Cuba, they have 70% of the population. I mean, they have a very high population density. And I'm sure that if we get information from the ministry on the land delivery in usufruct during the last years, I mean, since 2008, we will have an updated view of what is going on in these urban areas, peri-urban areas, because we know that suburban agriculture and urban agriculture is really increasing in these areas. And when we are talking about the opportunities of Black farmers or Afro-Cubans, we are also taking into account these areas because, as I said before, they have the highest population density, and we need to get this information. I'm trying to get data from Armando Nova because they are getting, they are updating the last data on land delivery usufruct, and apparently they are trying to get more information on women and to extent to which women have opportunities to get the land, and Black farmers. So I'm sure this data will complete this lack of information, and probably this previous exodus from rural areas to urban areas, because as you mentioned, Black people have more opportunities as artists, in sports. I mean, they have more opportunities in urban areas. And this is something also stressed by Hastings and Hoffman in their paper on these new inequalities in Cuba. So thanks a lot for your comments, Miguel.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments? Let me just look at the chat to see. Yes, I got 2 questions here, if not 3, I think. Hang on, no, the timing is wrong. It's all right, I'm looking at the wrong ones.
Al had a question and Alex had a question.
Okay, fire away.
Does my mic work now?
Yep, can hear you perfectly.
Hey, that's very good, because I'm supposed to present next session, and I think it'd be less interesting if nobody could hear me. Anyway, I just want to ask 2 quick questions, one historical and one present. If you think about the 2 land reforms, the one in '59 in particular, there was lots of newsreels we all saw where they gave certificates of land to the agricultural workers on the land. If we think about, you talked a little bit about the history going way back on the racism, back to the beginning of the 1900s, but just starting at that point in '59, if we think about the few small farmers that existed before '59, they were certainly mostly white. But what I have no idea about, and what I'm just absolutely asking about, is that large contingent, which was often presented as a creation of the peasantry in Cuba at that time, it was given to the agricultural workers. I would have thought that the agricultural workers would have been more Black than white. So do you have any sort of statistics on the racial composition of the people that received certificates to the land who had been agricultural workers in '59? That's the first question. And then related to that is the question, does that even matter anymore? What size, how many people were that compared to the number of people that have it today? And then the question on the present is, you gave some figures on the usufructarios and the relationship to, the figures were mixed together with people in the CCSs. And so the figures were very clear, as some speakers said before, as the overwhelming racial difference there. Do you have any way of sorting out, have you been able to sort out, let's leave aside the CCSs for the moment, and just talk about the usufructarios, which are, this huge new group that's gone into the peasantry since 2007, in some sense overwhelming some of the other groups. Do you have any way of sorting out, and this relates to questions which, several of the questions were just asked, do you have any way of sorting out if many more whites are taking usufructario status than Blacks? Is there any way of sorting out the difference between preference and some sort of process of discrimination in actually giving land to them? A number of people pointed out that a lot of people interviewed just said they don't want to be farmers because it's a hell of a job. And so is there any way of sorting out if there's a difference in the preference among Blacks to become usufructarios versus whites? That would be the second question.
Okay, big questions. Over to you. Marisa, Elisa.
Lisa, would you like to take the...
Well, I think that the first one is a very interesting question, but I don't really have the answer. So as you said, it was the creation of the peasantry. And as you said before, there were not basically farmers, but it's something we really need to go into. I mean, we really need to look into these questions. Well, there were some farmers, but we can, I mean, yeah, I totally agree. We need more information. And regarding to the second one, this is also related to the suburban agriculture program and what policies can engage, can promote, or can give more opportunities for Black farmers. I don't know. This is why we need to go to the field and do some interviews, because otherwise we won't get this information. But I think it is crucial. I mean, this is something we really need to get more qualitative information, because there isn't quantitative information. So we need to go to the field and do some field work and try to do some semi-structured interviews in order to sort this out. So sorry, I don't have the answers, Al. Thanks a lot for your
No, this is, I mean, it's great, because this is, we're just, as you can see, you know, last year we presented this, we're kind of building slowly on this, but I feel like we're going to put together a paper starting with what we know, and then moving on to what we don't know. And of course, with social science, there's always more what you don't know than what you know. I'm wary about talking about Afro-Cuban preferences without having direct data of, and I have limited data from my ethnographic data. I think there'd be interesting literary sources that would be worth exploring. So this is what we're putting together, is really a research project, which we're starting with a paper and then hoping to develop from there. But I think all of those are relevant questions. And Sara also, who's unfortunately not here, might have had the answer to your first question as well, because she's done research on that particular era in agrarian change and racialized agrarian change. So I think she might have been able to help there, but she's not here. So thanks, Al.
Can I come in with a question abusing my privilege here?
Do you want to let Alex have a go first? Or
sorry, where's that? Oh, sorry.
Alex has got his hand up.
Yeah. Okay. Alex, over you go.
Gracias, Tony. A mí me gustaría hacer algunos comentarios y una pregunta. Yo creo que es muy importante las cuestiones que trae este trabajo para analizar una realidad bien específica en Cuba, que es la de los campesinos. Y yo creo que tendríamos que quizás pensar, cuando hablamos de campesinos, ¿de qué estamos hablando? De quien vive en el campo, de quien trabaja en el campo, de quien es propietario de tierras en el campo. La categoría campesino puede abarcar a muchas personas. Ahora, es interesante, yo creo que para comprender esta problemática de los negros como campesinos en Cuba, primero me resulta súper positivo que alguien no familiarizado con el contexto cubano pueda hacer estas preguntas que muchas veces los cubanos no nos las hacemos, porque hemos naturalizado determinadas realidades socioculturales y cuando estamos dentro de un contexto, pues nos resulta muy difícil hacernos determinadas preguntas. Entonces me parece muy válida la pregunta: ¿dónde están los negros campesinos cubanos? ¿Quiénes son? ¿Existen? ¿No existen? ¿Cómo se conformó eso que llamamos campesinos en Cuba? Si tenemos un país donde por varios siglos los trabajadores del campo, los que trabajaban la tierra, los que producían las riquezas, fueron africanos traídos como esclavos a Cuba, luego fueron jamaicanos que emigraron a Cuba, haitianos que emigraron a Cuba. ¿Qué pasó con todas esas personas que por siglos trabajaron en condiciones de esclavitud en los campos de Cuba? ¿Qué pasó luego cuando los españoles, sobre todo españoles, vinieron y se asentaron en los campos cubanos? ¿Qué pasó con todas esas personas? ¿Cómo se distribuyeron? ¿Cómo se distribuyó la tierra? ¿Cómo se distribuyeron las propiedades desde antes del triunfo de la revolución? Son preguntas interesantes porque ciertamente cuando uno va a muchos contextos cubanos, uno se pregunta, ¿dónde están los negros? Fue una pregunta que yo también me hice cuando estaba haciendo mi trabajo de campo en una escuela en Cuba, cuando vi las estadísticas del color de la piel, que es lo que se usa en Cuba para clasificar a las personas. En la escuela donde yo estaba haciendo mi trabajo de campo, había solo 2 negros entre los estudiantes. Y eso nos lleva quizás a hacernos una pregunta sobre el censo de población en Cuba. ¿Cuáles son los problemas metodológicos que tiene ese censo para contabilizar a las personas por color de la piel? Y el último censo de población y vivienda en Cuba no se usa la autodeclaración para contabilizar a las personas por color de la piel. Es la persona que va a encuestar, por lo menos fue así hasta el último censo, quien va a encuestar mira a la persona que está siendo encuestada y marca en una casilla si él cree que es blanco, negro, mestizo, mulato o las opciones que tiene en su planilla. Y ahí nos topamos con el primer problema al ver los datos sobre negros en Cuba. El mismo problema que yo me topé en mi escuela cuando fui a hacer cuando vi las estadísticas y le pregunté a la secretaria, bueno, ¿cómo llegan a saber que hay 2 negros, 3 negros, 4 negros en la escuela? Y ella me dice, no, por la foto. Por una foto yo marco una casilla. Entonces ahí hay un problema en la metodología de clasificación de las personas y nos está dando un dato que ya de por sí está permeado por las maneras en que cada persona entiende lo que es blanco, negro, mulato, todas las categorías que tenemos en Cuba, jabao, etcétera, para clasificar el color de la piel de las personas. Y eso es un problema que encontrará cualquier investigación de cualquier tipo de corte que va a analizar un problema como este cuando se enfrenta a las estadísticas. Pero también tenemos un problema cultural. El antropólogo Sidney Mintz decía en estudios publicados en la década de los 80 que Cuba y República Dominicana, Puerto Rico son los pueblos que quizás tienen mayor distorsión en la autopercepción del color de la piel en América, a partir de estudios que él hacía. Entonces, estamos aquí ante problemas metodológicos, ante problemas quizás éticos, ante problemas de autopercepción y percepción de los otros cuando estamos hablando de negros.
Alex, ¿sí? ¿Te puedo interrumpir un poquito, por favor? Porque corre el tiempo y tenemos que dejarles a las presentadoras para responder.
Gracias, Tony. Iba a hacer la pregunta. Ajá. Teniendo en cuenta que a inicio de los 2000 Fidel reconocía que realmente aquella noción de que se había eliminado la discriminación racial en Cuba, el problema del racismo en Cuba y la existencia de políticas específicas para que los negros lleguen a determinados cargos, por ejemplo, pudiera pensarse en la necesidad de políticas afirmativas para los campesinos en Cuba, para beneficiar a los campesinos negros en Cuba.
Yeah, I think I understood, but I think I'm sorry. I'm going to reply in English but I had on one of these slides. There's a really interesting example. It just happens to be from California, where I'm from, but it's there's a policy that they've sort of a racial equality policy that they've implemented so that land can be redistributed based on, people who identify. And I guess that's the main point, is the methodological point that you're making is, I guess people get around that by having people self-identify in terms of whichever ethnic or racial background they identify with. So that's one way of doing it. So what I'm going to do is I'll find the name of that policy and I will put it into the chat box so that you can maybe have a look. But I think it's a really good example of how to start to tackle some of these long-term inequalities in the countryside. And there's lots of questions that come up here, and I'm really grateful for all the lines of questioning that we have to direct the paper and also the research. Thanks.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Alex, porque creo que son preguntas fundamentales, ¿no? Tanto tener mucha cautela cuando defines al campesino, que en Cuba siempre se necesita una amplia nota a pie de página para decir qué es el campesino privado, bueno, por esa compleja estructura, ¿no?, agraria que tiene el país, que cuando aterrizas la primera vez tardas días en comprender, pero eso es fundamental, estoy totalmente de acuerdo. Los problemas metodológicos también hay que aclararlos, ¿no?, de una manera rigurosa. Algo hemos dicho en la presentación, ¿no?, que bueno, pues tenemos el censo, ¿no?, en base al color de la piel, pero que bueno, vamos a tomar esta clasificación. Probablemente cuando podamos ir al campo podremos matizar un poco esto, pero también con mucha cautela, con mucho cuidado. Y creo que lo último, esta pregunta que planteabas, creo que se relaciona con lo que también planteabas antes para la juventud en el mundo rural, y también se relaciona con las oportunidades que tienen las mujeres en el mundo rural, no solo la juventud, ¿no?, la necesidad de que todas estas políticas de descentralización de la tierra o de insertar al campesino en la producción nacional de alimentos necesario, ¿no?, desde el periodo especial, sean mucho más específicas, ¿no?, estén mucho más enfocadas a esos grupos. Y creo que, bueno, es algo que también estoy observando en un artículo que estoy empezando a escribir sobre las oportunidades, ¿no?, de las mujeres desde la revolución en el campo cubano, ¿no? Creo que es muy interesante eso mismo que tú mencionabas antes para la juventud rural, ¿no?, tener unas políticas más específicas, descentralizadas, que gestionen, ¿no?, las instituciones a nivel local. Creo que eso es muy importante para las diferentes problemáticas, las diferentes desigualdades que existen en el mundo rural, no solo en el cubano, creo que pasa en la mayor parte de los países, ¿no?, del mundo. Nada más, muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos, a las presentadoras y también a los que han preguntado y comentado. Muchísimas gracias. Entonces, casi perfectamente hemos llegado al final, pero una sesión muy compleja y combinando todos los aspectos muy relacionados entre sí. Y por eso les doy las gracias a todas. Y bueno, a ti te paso la palabra, ¿no?, para organizar este descanso. La idea de organizar un descanso es interesante, pero me refiero más a las palabras de apertura.
Bueno, es un descanso organizado, de manera de que vamos a esperar un poquito antes de tomar el café, porque tenemos el gran honor de tener entre nosotros la embajadora, su Excelencia Bárbara Montalvo Álvarez, de la Embajada de Cuba en el Reino Unido. Y está en línea, así que yo creo que en algún momento va a aparecer y va a abrir unas palabras, va a abrir la sesión con unas palabras de inauguración. Así que muchas gracias a todos los panelistas hasta ahora. Michelle, ¿estás aquí?
Estamos aquí.
Muy bien, buenos días, buenas tardes.
Bien, buenas tardes. Well, I would like to thank the organizers of this edition of the annual conference of the Cuba Research Forum, and especially Bar, who's put so much effort in keeping this forum alive. For the second time, unfortunately, the meeting is held online, I think most of us did not expect to be still under the impact of this terrible pandemic. But one day we will be able to resume face-to-face meetings here in UK or in Cuba, and it will be a source for special joy. Nada puede sustituir el intercambio directo entre las personas y yo creo que mucho menos entre investigadores y académicos. These conferences and workshops has been held for more than 20 years. It's impressive. I think you have constructed a privileged space and a channel of communication of great importance as they allows experts, scholars, and specialists to come together to analyze and exchange about an historical fact, which is Cuban Revolution. Yo estoy segura que ya ustedes comenzaron a contribuir a la mejor comprensión de la naturaleza y de los desafíos que hoy el proceso revolucionario cubano afronta en este momento complejo. The serious and the rigorous study of what is happening in Cuba takes on particular relevance in the current circumstances. And I want to express how much I'm pleased that this forum is held. The diversity of topics and prestigious speakers, as well as the academic university collaboration, foretells the success of this exchange. As you know, President Díaz-Canel has attached enormous significance to the contribution of Cuban science in all areas to the improvement of the economic social model, to the adjustment of the reform processes on the way for some years now. Nosotros también hemos tomado en este proceso, que no es reciente, las experiencias de otros modelos de países con sistemas socialistas o capitalistas, no para copiar, sino para tomar aquello que pueda ser viable en nuestras condiciones y que puedan contribuir a nuestros esfuerzos. And I think it is of great interest contrasting one's own vision with that of others, identifying possible points of convergence about a process that, in my opinion, in our opinion, due to external factors, is developing in truly difficult and different conditions from any other country on the planet. Contrary to what some may think, we do not reject opposing point of view. We are not a perfect model, but which model is perfect? Lo que sí creo importante tener en cuenta en cualquier análisis sobre Cuba es que nosotros nunca hemos aceptado la interferencia externa en nuestros asuntos internos y que desde luego no es ahora que nosotros vamos a cambiar un comportamiento que está profundamente arraigado en nosotros desde que se fraguó y nació la nación cubana. The facts are there to be evaluated. We have denounced the communication operation against Cuba, which is still ongoing. There is a lot of information available about the US sanctions. We know that not all of our problems have to do with the blockade, but it is an unquestionable truth that the blockade is the main obstacle not only for our development as a nation, but for the well-being of the Cuban people. Since the beginning of the pandemic, information of the handling of the COVID has been provided every day, both when the numbers were better and when we faced a second wave that everyone knows is hitting us hard. We do not hide behind data showing mortality rate of COVID-19 in Cuba compared to other countries. We simply continue to do our effort, our best effort in the toughest economic conditions. I think that science and academia can contribute to the debate, which would not imply, from my point of view, taking a position either in favor or against Cuba, nor any ideological commitment. Algunos pueden considerar una quimera, un error, una utopía, lo que Cuba ha hecho o trata de hacer. Sin embargo, la ciencia, la academia, puede ofrecer evidencia de las condiciones en que lo hemos tenido que hacer. And that is why I highly appreciate the exchange, the discussions that are holding in this edition. Es con mis mayores deseos de éxito en este evento que termino con profunda gratitud y mi consideración personal para todos ustedes. It is with my best wishes for a successful conference that I finish with profound gratitude and my consideration for all of you. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much for all.
Muchas gracias. Muchísimas gracias a usted, a los colegas de la embajada, nuestros colegas y amigos. Ustedes siempre están bienvenidos entre nosotros. Pueden pasar algún tiempo en el evento, en los días que quedan, pero sé que están muy ocupados. Así que muchas gracias, Su Excelencia, y siempre estamos trabajando juntos y colaborando en proyectos como este.
Ustedes saben que pueden contar con nosotros para lo que podamos aportar para que su trabajo se lleve a cabo en las mejores condiciones y desde luego nos mantendremos al tanto, aunque no podamos estar permanentemente con ustedes compartiendo este debate.
Eso, y esperamos que pronto llegue ese día en que nos podamos ver en persona.
A ustedes.
Muchas gracias.
Bueno, chao. Los dejo descansar ahora.
Chao, gracias. Chao.
Chao.
Bueno, cafecito hasta las 4:30 hora británica, que son 11:30 hora cubana o hora estadounidense, ¿ok? Son como 15 minutos, un poquito más de 15 minutos. Hasta ahora.